Some men measure courage by the size of their enemy. Dalton Pierce measured it by the size of his lie. The woman standing before him was nearly a foot taller, her shadow swallowing his in the afternoon sun. Behind her, 24 armed warriors watched with fingers tight on their weapons. Behind him, nothing but empty desert and a half-broken ranch that barely kept him fed. He was on his knees in the dust, holding the hand of a woman he'd never spoken to, telling the biggest lie of his life. And the strange part, she hadn't pulled away. Her fingers, rough and strong enough to snap his wrist, remained perfectly still in his grip, almost like she'd been waiting for anyone, to do something this reckless. What Dalton didn't know was that his lie would force him to answer a question he'd been avoiding for 3 years. What are you willing to lose for something real? The morning had started the way most did. Quiet. Too quiet. Dalton's ranch sat in a pocket of land where the desert met grassland, close enough to Apache territory that most settlers wouldn't risk it. But Dalton had always kept his distance from other colonists, and the Apache had come to tolerate his presence. He traded fairly, never pushed boundaries, never caused trouble. He was alone, and he preferred it that way. Or at least that's what he told himself every morning when he woke to an empty house. He'd been mending fence posts when he heard them. Voices carried on the wind. Too many to be a hunting party. Dalton straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and watched as a group crested the ridge to the east. 2 groups, actually. He recognized the closer one, warriors from the band that sometimes traded with him. But the others, the ones riding behind with harder faces and weapons held ready, those he didn't know. Something felt wrong. The way they moved, too formal, too tense. This wasn't a friendly meeting. Dalton should have gone back to his fence. Should have minded his own survival, like he'd done for 3 years. But his feet carried him toward the ridge instead. Curiosity pulling harder than common sense. He kept low, moving through brush and rock until he could see the gathering below. That's when he saw her. The woman stood a full head taller than any warrior present. Her frame not just tall, but powerful in a way that made everyone around her seem smaller by proximity. She wore traditional Apache clothing, but the way she carried herself spoke of someone who'd earned respect through more than heritage. Her arms were crossed, jaw set, and even from a distance, Dalton could read the anger in every line of her posture. An older warrior was speaking, his tone carrying authority. Dalton's Apache was rough, learned through trade and observation, but he caught enough to understand. Marriage, alliance, duty to the people. The woman's response was sharp enough to make several warriors flinch. She refused. Flat, absolute refusal. That's when the other man stepped forward, taller than the others, scarred face twisted in something between a smile and a snarl. Korik. Even without understanding every word, Dalton knew a threat when he heard one. The way the man moved closer to her. The way his hand rested on his weapon. The way the warriors behind him shifted in unified menace. She was being given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Marry this man, or there would be consequences for her people. Dalton watched her hands curl into fists, watched her stand her ground even as the circle tightened. And he recognized something in her stance, something that hit him square in the chest with unexpected force. She was alone, surrounded by people, forced into an impossible situation, and completely alone. His feet were moving before his brain caught up. Down the ridge, across open ground, straight into a situation that could get him ended in about 15 different ways. Warriors turned, weapons raised, voices shouting, but Dalton kept walking, hands visible until he stood at the edge of the circle. They all stared at him. The woman's eyes met his, dark and questioning, trying to understand what kind of fool walks into an armed standoff. Dalton swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, heart hammering against his ribs. But he'd started this walk, and there was only one direction left to go. Forward. He looked at the older warrior, then at Korik, then back to the woman. And before he could talk himself out of it, before sanity could reclaim him, Dalton dropped to one knee in the dust and reached for her hand. The moment his fingers touched hers, the shouting intensified. But Dalton raised his voice over the chaos, speaking in broken but determined Apache. She was already promised to him. They'd made an agreement, trading interaction by trading interaction, building toward this moment. It was done. She was his intended. Every word was a lie. But Dalton had never meant anything more in his life. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. Takakota stared down at the man kneeling before her. This stranger, with sun-darkened skin and worn clothing, who just walked into the center of an armed confrontation and claimed her as his own. His hand trembled slightly where it held hers, but his eyes stayed locked on hers with an intensity that asked a silent question. She could expose him right now. One word, and this foolish lie would collapse. But something stopped her tongue. Maybe it was the desperation she recognized in his face, the kind that came from having nothing left to lose. Maybe it was the way Korik's expression had shifted from triumph to rage in the span of a heartbeat. Or maybe somewhere deeper, it was the realization that this stranger had just offered her the only escape she hadn't considered, a way out that didn't require her people to bleed. The older warrior Nishoba stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion and suspicion. He spoke directly to Takakota, his words sharp. When had this happened? Why had she said nothing? Why had no one witnessed this arrangement? Takakota felt every eye on her. The warriors from her own band looked betrayed. Korik's men gripped their weapons tighter, waiting for their leader's signal. And this man, this reckless stranger, still on his knee, waited for her to either save or destroy him. She made her choice. Her fingers closed around his hand, firm and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried across the desert floor with absolute certainty. They had traded many times over the passing seasons. Words had been exchanged, intentions made clear. She had given her word, and her word was not something she broke for political convenience. The lie tasted strange on her tongue, but it came out smooth as truth. Korik exploded. He surged forward, his scarred face twisted with fury, hand reaching for the blade at his belt. But Nishoba moved between them, his authority still holding weight. This changed everything. The older warrior said, if there was a prior claim, it had to be honored. To break such an agreement would bring dishonor. The stranger, Dalton, she realized she'd heard his name in trading talks, rose slowly to his feet. Even standing, he barely reached her shoulder. But he didn't shrink from Korik's rage, didn't step back when the larger warrior closed the distance between them. Korik spoke in rapid, harsh tones. His tribe had traveled for days. The alliance had been promised. This settler had no right, no claim, no honor. He spat the last word like poison. Dalton responded in broken but determined Apache, supplementing with hand signs. When words failed him, he meant no disrespect to Korik's tribe. But what had been agreed between him and Takakota came first. If Korik wished to challenge, that Dalton would accept whatever test was required to prove his claim was genuine. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Takakota's mind raced. This man had no idea what he just offered. In her culture, such challenges were settled through combat, endurance tests, or trials that could easily result in severe injury or worse. He was smaller, clearly not a warrior, and would stand no chance against Korik in any physical contest. But before Korik could accept, Nishoba raised his hand. There would be no challenge today. This situation required the council's wisdom, not bloodshed in the dust. Both parties would present their cases before the elders at sunset. Until then, Dalton would remain as Takakota's guest under her protection. To harm him would be to harm her directly. It was clever. Dakota realized Nishoba was buying time, preventing immediate violence, while forcing everyone to think through the implications. But it also meant she and Dalton would have to maintain this lie under intense scrutiny for the rest of the day. Korik's hand lingered on his blade, fury radiating from every muscle. But he couldn't define Shoba's authority without fracturing the already fragile alliance between their peoples. He nodded once, sharp and hostile, then turned and strode away, his warriors following like a storm cloud moving across the landscape. The tension broke slightly, but didn't disappear. Dakota's own people stared at her with questions in their eyes. questions she couldn't answer without exposing the truth. Dalton finally released her hand, and she felt the absence immediately. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw a real fear crack through his determined facade. What had they just done? Neshoba approached them both, his voice low and measured. At sunset, they would need to provide proof of their arrangement. Witnesses, gifts exchanged, some evidence that this agreement existed before today. Without it, the council would see through the deception, and Korik would have his justification for violence. Takakota and Dalton exchanged a glance. They had nothing. No witnesses, no gifts, no history. Just a lie told in desperation, and a few hours to make it believable enough to survive. They walked in silence toward Dalton's ranch, the midday sun beating down on them like judgment itself. Takakota's people had dispersed to prepare for the evening council, leaving her alone with this stranger who tied both their fates together with a single reckless lie. She could feel his nervous energy radiating beside her, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. When they crested the ridge and his property came into view, Takakota understood immediately why he lived alone. The ranch wasn't just small. It was barely surviving. A single structure with patched walls, a corral with posts that leaned at odd angles, and land that looked like it fought him for every blade of grass. This wasn't a man building a future. This was a man holding on to the past by his fingernails. Dalton cleared his throat, the first sound either had made since leaving the gathering. His voice came out rougher than before, stripped of the false confidence he'd shown the warriors. I should explain. Takakota stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the open desert, their height difference was even more pronounced. She crossed her arms, waiting. He struggled with the Apache words, switching to English when they failed him, hoping she understood enough. She did. Years of trading had given her more understanding than most of her people cared to admit. I didn't plan this. I was fixing fence posts and heard voices. I came to see what was happening, and I saw. He paused, searching for words. I saw someone being forced into something they didn't want. I recognized it, that feeling of being trapped by other people's choices. Takakota's eyes narrowed. You risked your life for a feeling. I risked my life because it was the right thing to do. She almost laughed. The right thing, as if honor and righteousness could stop Korik's blade or prevent a war between peoples. But something in his face made her swallow the mockery. He believed it. This fool genuinely believed in doing right, even when it cost him everything. We have no proof, she said flatly, switching to English to make certain he understood every word. No witnesses saw us trade. No gifts were exchanged. Nothing to show the council that would make them believe your lie. Our lie. Dalton corrected quietly. You backed it. You didn't have to. He was right. She could have exposed him immediately, let Neshoba's warriors remove him, and returned to facing Korik alone. But she hadn't. Some instinct, some desperate hope had made her grasp onto this impossible escape. Dalton walked to his small home and pushed open the door. Inside, the space was sparse but clean. A single bed, a table, 2 chairs, shelves with supplies carefully organized. But what caught Dakota's attention was the corner, where a woman's belongings still sat untouched. A brush with long hair still tangled in its bristles. A shawl folded precisely. A pair of worn boots that would fit someone much smaller than Dalton. He saw where her gaze had landed and his jaw tightened. My wife. 3 years ago. Fever took her in less than a week. The words were simple, but the pain underneath them ran deeper than any river. Takakota understood then why he'd intervened, why he lived alone, why he'd recognized something in her situation that moved him to action. He knew what it meant to lose choice, to have fate tear away everything and leave you standing in the ruins. She moved closer, examining the belongings with respect. You keep her things. I don't know how to let go. Takakota turned back to him, and for the first time since this began, she saw him not as a foolish settler or a convenient escape, but as a man carrying weight that matched her own. We need to create a history that doesn't exist, she said, her mind already working through possibilities, trading interactions that led to understanding conversations that built connection. moments that would make our arrangement seem natural. Dalton nodded slowly. We have until sunset. That's maybe 5-6 hours. Then we start now. Tell me about your wife, her name, how you met, what you loved about her. I need to know who you were before you became this isolated man. He looked confused. Why does that matter? Because if we're going to convince my people that you're capable of making a genuine commitment to someone from a different world, I need to understand the man who did it before. Dalton sat heavily in one of the chairs, exhaustion suddenly visible in every line of his body. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' silence finally breaking. Her name was Caroline, and as the sun moved across the sky, two strangers began building a false history from fragments of real pain, hoping it would be enough to save them both. But neither noticed the figure watching from the distant ridge. Kurik's most trusted scout, taking note of every detail. Dalton's hands shook slightly as he poured water into 2 tin cups. Talking about Caroline felt like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. But Takakota was right. If they were going to sell this lie, they needed truth woven through it. We met at a trading post. He began handing her a cup. She was traveling with her father, a merchant. I was there selling cattle for my family's ranch back east. She spilled flour on my boots and apologized for 10 minutes straight. Dakota listened intently, her dark eyes studying him in a way that made him feel exposed. You left your family's ranch to come here. The question hit harder than she knew. Dalton looked away, focusing on the worn floorboards. After Caroline died, I couldn't stay. Too many memories. My brother took over the family land. I came west with nothing. Bought this piece of ground with the last of what I had. Running, Takakota said quietly. It wasn't a judgment, just observation. Running, he agreed. She stood and moved to the window, her impressive frame filling the space. When I was younger, I was always the tallest girl, then the tallest among the boys. By the time I reached womanhood, I stood taller than our greatest warriors. My people value strength, but they also value tradition. A woman of my size makes men uncomfortable. Dalton watched her profile, backlit by the afternoon sun. Uncomfortable, because you could probably best most of them in a fight. A slight smile touched her lips. I have many times in training, in contests. I earned my place among the warriors through skill, not because they wanted to give it to me, but that same strength that makes me valuable in battle makes me unsuitable for marriage in their eyes. No man wants a wife who towers over him. Their loss, Dalton said before he could stop himself. She turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her features. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Takakota cleared her throat and returned to practical matters. We need our story to be specific. When did we first trade? Dalton thought back. About 2 years ago, early autumn. You came with 3 other warriors. You traded dried venison for coffee and sugar. Her eyes widened slightly. You remember that? You're hard to forget. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight neither had intended. Takakota shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, and Dalton rushed to fill the silence. We need to say the conversations grew over time, that during trades we talked. You taught me better Apache. I taught you more English. That understanding built between us. And when did this understanding become an arrangement? Dakota asked, her voice careful. Last spring. You came alone that time. I remember. It was raining. Dalton stood warming to the fabrication. We talked longer than usual about loneliness, about not fitting into the spaces our worlds created for us, and I asked if you'd ever considered a different path. Takakota nodded slowly, building on his foundation. I would have been skeptical, suspicious of a settler's intentions, but you offered respect. Not ownership, a partnership, not possession. Exactly. We agreed to consider it, to meet during trades, and see if the idea had merit. We kept it quiet because we knew both our peoples would resist. They spent the next hour refining details, creating a history from whole cloth. The stories felt true even as they spoke them, built from genuine moments and real understanding. Dalton found himself almost believing they'd had these conversations, these connections. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, reality reasserted itself. Takakota noticed it first, her body tensing as she looked toward the ridge. Someone was watching earlier from the north ridge. Dalton's stomach dropped. Kuruk's man, most likely, which means he saw us talking, saw us building this story. Her jaw tightened. If he reports what he observed, Kuruk will know we spent the day fabricating proof instead of having evidence ready. The foundation they'd carefully constructed suddenly felt fragile as sun-dried clay. One wrong question at the council, one detail they couldn't corroborate, and the entire deception would crumble. Takakota moved toward the door, her warrior instincts taking over. We need to go. The council will gather soon, and arriving late shows disrespect. Dalton followed her outside, his heart hammering. In a few short hours, his impulsive lie had become a web of fabrication that would either save them both or condemn them. As they walked toward the gathering place, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kuruk was already 3 steps ahead, waiting for the perfect moment to tear their story apart. The council gathered as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. A circle of elders sat on warm blankets, their weathered faces unreadable. Behind them, warriors from both tribes stood in tense formation, hands never far from weapons. Dalton felt the weight of every eye as he and Takakota approached the circle's edge. Nishoba gestured for them to enter. They sat together close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, presenting unity, even as Dalton's nerves screamed at him to run. Across the circle, Kuruk sat with predatory stillness, his scarred face split by a smile that promised violence. The eldest council member, a woman whose age showed in silver hair, but not in the sharpness of her gaze, spoke first. Her words were formal, measured. She asked Takakota to explain the arrangement that had been claimed. Takakota's voice came out steady, strong. She recounted their fabricated history exactly as they'd rehearsed. First trade 2 years prior, gradually building conversations, a spring meeting where possibility was discussed, quiet understanding that grew over seasons of respectful interaction. It sounded convincing, almost beautiful in its simplicity. Then Kuruk spoke, and the temperature seemed to drop despite the evening heat. He addressed the council with false courtesy, but his words carried edges sharp enough to cut. How convenient that this arrangement remained secret until the very moment it became useful. How strange that a woman who showed no interest in any warrior of her own people would suddenly commit to an outsider. How suspicious that not a single person could verify even one of these supposed meetings. The council members shifted, doubt creeping into their expressions. Dalton felt panic rising in his throat. Kuruk was dismantling their story piece by piece, and they had no defense beyond their word. He opened his mouth to speak, but Dakota's hand found his, squeezing once in warning. "Let me handle this," the gesture said. She responded to Kuruk with controlled fury. She'd kept the arrangement private precisely because she knew her people would react with doubt and judgment, as they were doing now. She'd chosen discretion because she valued Dalton's safety, knowing some would see his interest as insult or invasion, and she'd said nothing, because the decision was hers alone to make, not something requiring tribal approval or permission. Her words rang with such conviction that several council members nodded slightly. But Kuruk wasn't finished. He stood, his full height intimidating even at a distance. He addressed the elders directly, his tone shifting to something darker. He'd sent a trusted warrior to observe today. That warrior had watched Takakota and the settlers spend hours inside his dwelling, talking frantically, building stories from nothing. The warrior had seen no evidence of prior connection, only desperation to create the appearance of one. The council erupted in low murmurs. Takakota's grip on Dalton's hand tightened until her knuckles went white. Nishoba called for silence, his authority cutting through the noise. He looked at Takakota with something between disappointment and sympathy. If what Kara claimed was true, she had dishonored herself and her people. But he would give her one chance to provide proof beyond words. "Show us something," Nishoba said quietly. "Some evidence that what you claim is truth." Takakota's face remained composed, but Dalton felt her hand trembling in his. They had nothing. No gifts, no tokens, no physical proof of a relationship that didn't exist. The silence stretched. Kurik's smile widened. Then Dalton thought of Caroline's belongings still sitting in the corner of his home. The shawl she'd worn, the brush she'd used, items he'd kept for 3 years because letting them go meant accepting she was truly gone. Without thinking through the implications, he spoke. He could provide proof. Something Takakoda had given him during their spring meeting. A gift that held personal significance that he'd kept close since receiving it. Every eye turned to him. Kurik's smile faltered slightly, uncertainty creeping in. Nishoba nodded. Then bring this gift tomorrow at first light. The council will examine it and judge its authenticity. Tomorrow. Dalton had bought them one more night. But now he'd trapped them in an even tighter corner. He'd have to take something of Caroline's, claim it came from Takakoda, and hope no one questioned too deeply. As the council dispersed, Kurik passed close to them, his voice low enough that only they could hear. Whatever you bring, I'll prove it's a lie. And when I do, she'll be mine, and you'll be in the ground. The threat hung in the cooling air as they walked back toward Dalton's ranch, both knowing the morning would bring either their salvation or their end. The moon hung low over the desert as Dalton stood alone in his small home, staring at Caroline's belongings. Takakoda had stepped outside to give him privacy, understanding without words that what he was about to do required a moment of solitude. His hands trembled as he reached for the shawl. It still carried the faintest trace of her scent. Or maybe that was just memory playing tricks. For 3 years, he'd preserved these items exactly as she'd left them, as if moving them would somehow erase the last physical proof she'd existed. Now he was going to use them to build a lie. The door opened softly. Dakota ducked through the frame, her presence filling the small space. She moved to stand beside him, looking down at the simple belongings with respect. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I can refuse Kurik. Fight him if necessary. You don't have to sacrifice your wife's memory for me." Dalton shook his head, surprised by how clear his thoughts had become. Caroline would have helped you. She always stood up for people being forced into situations they didn't choose. It drove her father mad sometimes, the way she'd argue with men twice her age about fairness and dignity. He picked up the shawl, feeling its weight. "The first time I saw you at that council gathering, you reminded me of her. Not in appearance, but in that same stubborn refusal to accept injustice. Caroline would have walked right into that circle of warriors, just like I did." Takakoda's expression softened. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Dalton folded the shawl carefully. "But she's gone, and you're here alive with your whole future ahead of you. I think she'd understand that holding on to ghosts doesn't honor the dead. Living does." He turned to face Dakota fully, and the words came before he could stop them. This started as a lie, a desperate, foolish lie. But somewhere in the last day, it stopped feeling entirely false. We build a story about two people who didn't fit in their worlds, finding understanding in each other. And that part at least isn't a lie anymore. The silence stretched between them, charged with something neither could name. Takakoda reached out slowly, her large hand gentle as it touched his shoulder. "In my culture, we believe actions reveal truth more than words. You walked into danger for a stranger. You offered yourself as sacrifice without hesitation. You're about to give up the last pieces of someone you love to save someone you barely know." Her voice dropped lower. "Those actions tell me everything about who you are, Dalton Pierce." He looked up at her, seeing her not as the intimidating warrior who towered over him, but as the woman who'd carried loneliness as heavy as his own, and you chose to support a lie from a stranger. You could have exposed me, let your people handle it their way, but you trusted me enough to tie your fate to mine. That tells me who you are." Takakoda's hand moved from his shoulder to his face, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. For a breathless moment, they stood frozen, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Takakoda stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should prepare our story for tomorrow. If we present the Shaw, we need to explain when I gave it to you why it was significant what it represented." Dalton nodded, pushing aside the moment, even as it lingered in his chest. They spent the next hour crafting the details. The shawl had been a gift during their spring meeting. Takakota's way of showing trust. She'd woven it herself, which was truthful enough since many Apache women did weave. It represented her willingness to bridge their two worlds. As they worked, Dalton noticed Dakota's fingers brushing against his more often than necessary. The way her eyes lingered when she thought he wasn't looking, the careful way she positioned herself, always within arm's reach. Something had shifted between them, something that made the fake marriage feel less fake. With every passing hour, Dawn began painting the eastern sky with pale light. They'd spent the entire night preparing, and now exhaustion pulled at them both. But there was no time for rest. The council would gather soon, and they'd have one chance to sell their story. As they prepared to leave, Takakota caught Dalton's hand. "Whatever happens today, thank you for seeing me as more than what others decided I should be." Dalton squeezed back. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop hiding from life." They walked toward the gathering place as the sun broke the horizon, carrying Caroline's shawl and a lie that had somehow become the most honest thing either had done in years. The council sat in the same formation as the previous evening, but the morning light revealed details darkness had hidden. The elders' faces showed exhaustion from a night spent debating. Warriors on both sides gripped their weapons with barely restrained tension. One wrong word could ignite violence that would consume them all. Nishoba gestured for Dalton and Takakota to approach. They entered the circle together, Dalton carrying the folded shawl like an offering. Kuruk watched from across the space, his expression unreadable, but his body coiled like a snake preparing to strike. The eldest council member spoke. "You claim to have proof of your arrangement. Present it now." Dalton stepped forward, unfolding the shawl for all to see. The fabric was simple but well made, its weaving pattern traditional to Apache craft. He explained in careful Apache, supplemented with hand signs when words failed, that Takakota had given him this during their spring meeting. It represented her willingness to bridge their worlds, her trust in him, her commitment to exploring what they might build together. Several elders leaned forward, examining the shawl from their positions. One woman skilled in weaving studied the pattern with particular intensity. She confirmed it was genuine Apache work, the pattern traditional with subtle variations. But Kuruk rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the tentative acceptance. He acknowledged the shawl was Apache-made, but that proved nothing. Takakota could have taken any woven item from her dwelling this morning. The shawl's existence didn't prove she'd given it to Dalton months ago. It proved only that she was clever enough to create supporting evidence for a lie. The accusation hung heavy. Several elders exchanged glances, doubt creeping back. Then Kuruk delivered his strongest argument. He'd questioned people from Takakota's band extensively. None remembered seeing this particular shawl before. If it was important enough to give as a significant gift, surely someone would have noticed it missing or seen her weaving it or heard her mention its purpose. The logic was damning. The silence stretched as the council waited for an explanation. Nishoba stood slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. He approached the shawl, running his fingers along the edge. Then he turned to face the gathered people, his voice carrying authority earned through decades of wisdom. "I have listened to accusations and denials, but I have also watched carefully." He looked at Takakota. "When this man made his claim yesterday, you could have rejected him immediately. One word from you, and we would have removed him. Yet you supported his words without hesitation. Why would you risk your honor and your people's trust for a lie created in that moment?" Takakota met his gaze steadily. "Because his words were not a lie." Nishoba nodded, then turned to Kuruk. "You claim they fabricated everything yesterday. But consider this. If the shawl was taken hastily this morning, it would show signs of recent handling. Dust from storage, the stiffness of fabric long unused." He held up the shawl. "This has been carried, folded, and unfolded many times. The edges show wear from frequent touch. This is not something grabbed in desperation. This is something kept close and handled often." The observation was simple but powerful. Dalton felt his chest tighten as he realized the truth of it. He had handled Caroline Shaw countless times over 3 years, and that wear was visible to anyone who looked carefully. Nishoba continued, his voice measured. Moreover, Takakota's reaction yesterday tells us everything. A warrior of her standing does not make split-second decisions to support false claims. She would have seen through deception immediately and rejected it to protect her honor. Her instant acceptance suggests prior understanding, not improvisation. Several elders nodded slowly, the logic settling over them. Kurik's face darkened, but he had no counter to Nishoba's reasoning. The evidence wasn't perfect, but it was consistent with the story Dalton and Takakota had presented. Nishoba consulted quietly with the other council members. The discussion lasted long enough that Dalton's legs began to ache from standing rigid, afraid to show any weakness. Finally, Noba raised his hand for silence. The council had reached a decision. If Dakota and Dalton had indeed formed this arrangement in good faith, as the evidence suggested, it would be honored. But there was one condition. They must complete the marriage before sunset today, in the traditional way, before all gathered witnesses. Only then would the matter be settled and Kurik's claim dissolved. Dalton and Takakota exchanged glances. They'd fought for the right to their lie, and now they'd have to make it permanent truth. The sun moved inexorably toward the western mountains as preparations began. Takakota's people constructed a ceremonial space in the open desert, marking boundaries with stones and placing woven blankets for the couple to stand upon. Warriors from both tribes gathered, their weapons visible but lowered, creating an uneasy peace held together by tradition and the council's authority. Dalton stood at the edge of his small ranch, watching the distant preparations. His hands were steady now, the trembling fear of the previous day replaced by something else. Certainty, maybe, or acceptance that he'd stepped onto a path that could only move forward. Takakota approached from behind, her footsteps deliberate enough to announce her presence. She'd changed into traditional ceremonial clothing, the intricate beadwork catching the afternoon light. Even dressed formally, she remained every inch the warrior, her bearing proud despite the complicated circumstances that brought them here. "You can still walk away," she said quietly. "I could tell the council I've changed my mind." Face Kurik directly. "This doesn't have to be your burden." Dalton turned to face her. "Is that what you want?" She hesitated, and in that pause he saw the truth. "No, but I need to know this is your choice. Not just you being trapped by your own nobility." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Even having spent a day and night in her presence, her height still caught him off guard, but it didn't intimidate him anymore. Instead, it felt right somehow. This physical difference that mirrored all the other ways they didn't match, yet somehow fit. Yesterday, this was a lie told in desperation. Dalton said, "But we spent last night talking about everything except the council, about Caroline and your childhood, about dreams we'd given up on and fears we'd never spoken aloud. That wasn't fake, Takakota. That was more honest than anything I've done in 3 years." Her expression softened, vulnerability breaking through her warrior's mask. "In my culture, marriage is sacred. Once spoken before the people, it cannot be undone without great dishonor. If we do this, we're bound, truly bound. I understand. Do you?" She reached out her large hand, cupping his face with surprising gentleness. "Because I need you to understand that I'm choosing this too. Not because Kurik forces it, not because the council demands it, but because yesterday, a man I'd never met walked into danger for me. And last night, that same man showed me parts of himself he'd kept buried. And I want to know what we might become if we stop pretending and start building something real." Dalton covered her hand with his own. "Then let's stop pretending." The ceremony began as the sun kissed the horizon. Shoba led the ritual, his words formal, but carrying weight. Dalton and Dakota stood on the woven blankets, facing each other as promises were spoken in Apache and English, binding them before all assembled witnesses. When the moment came to seal the union, Takakota lowered herself to one knee, bringing her face level with Dalton's. The gesture was deliberate, a warrior's acknowledgement of partnership rather than dominance. Their hands clasped together, rough Callus's meeting, and the kiss that followed was brief but genuine. The gathered people voiced their acceptance, the sound carrying across the desert. Even Kuruk remained silent, his fury contained by the weight of tradition and the council's decree. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Kuruk approached. He stopped at a respectful distance, his scarred face unreadable. When he spoke, his words carried grudging respect rather than threat. "You surprised me, settler. Few men would risk what you risked." He looked at Takakoda. "And you've chosen your path. May it bring you the freedom you sought." It wasn't friendship, but it was acceptance. Kuruk walked away with his warriors, the threat of violence finally dissipating like desert heat after sunset. Dalton and Takakoda stood together, watching the groups depart until only Nishoba remained. The older warrior approached with measured steps. "Your ranch is small," he said to Dalton. "Too small for two people to live well. Takakoda's people will help you build it larger. That is how we honor marriages that bridge our worlds." The offer was unexpected, generous. Dalton bowed his head in gratitude. As full darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Dalton and Takakoda walked back toward the ranch that would now be their shared home. Neither spoke, but their hands remained clasped. Two people who'd found each other through lies and desperation and chose to build truth from that fractured foundation. The poor rancher had offered a fake marriage to save an Apache woman from being forced. But somewhere between the lie and the ceremony, it had become the most real thing either had ever known. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and fate collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.